On the last night of May 2005, a group of American teenagers walked out of a nightclub in Oranjestad, Aruba, and into the warm Caribbean dark. One of them, an 18-year-old girl named Natalee Holloway, told her friends not to wait up. She said she'd catch a ride back to the hotel. She climbed into a car with 3 young men she'd met that night, and the car pulled away. Nobody in her group ever saw her again. For 18 years, that was where the story stopped. A car door closing, taillights fading into the dark, and then nothing. No body. No confession. No answer. Just a mother who refused to stop asking the same question, year after year, long after the cameras stopped caring. In October of 2023, in a courtroom less than an hour from the Alabama neighborhood where Natalee grew up, the man responsible finally opened his mouth and told the truth. What he said was worse than anyone had let themselves imagine. And what makes this story genuinely horrifying isn't just what happened to Natalee. It's what happened in the 5 years after, while the man who killed her walked around free, untouched, unpunished, and did it again. Before she was a name on cable news, Natalee Holloway was just a kid from Mountain Brook, a comfortable, tree-lined suburb outside Birmingham, Alabama. People who knew her described someone easy to like, smart, warm, a little goofy with her friends, serious about her future. She graduated with honors. She'd already been accepted to the University of Alabama, where she planned to study on a pre-med track with an eye toward becoming a doctor. She danced competitively. She was tight with her mother, Beth, in the particular way daughters and mothers sometimes are when they've weathered things together. By every account from people who actually knew her, she was ordinary in the best sense of the word. A teenager with a full life mapped out in front of her, the kind of future a parent allows themselves to picture down to the details. That May, Natalee joined more than 100 of her classmates on a graduation trip to Aruba, a tiny Dutch island off the coast of Venezuela known mostly for its beaches, its calm turquoise water, and its reputation as one of the safer vacation spots in the Caribbean. The group checked into a beachfront hotel on Palm Beach, the strip where most of the island's big resorts sit shoulder to shoulder. For several days, it was an entirely unremarkable senior trip. Sunburns, curfews nobody enforced, the giddy, slightly reckless energy of teenagers getting their first real taste of freedom before real adulthood arrived. Their flight home was booked for the morning of May 30th. On their last night on the island, a chunk of the group headed out to a club downtown, the kind of loud, packed tourist spot where locals and visitors mix and nobody remembers exactly who talked to whom. That's where Natalee met a young man named Joran van der Sloot. He was 17, Dutch, and had grown up on Aruba. Tall, well-spoken in several languages, and comfortable in a way that people around him tended to notice. His father was a lawyer working toward a judgeship on the island, which meant Joran had grown up around courtrooms and connections most local teenagers didn't have. He was there that night with 2 brothers, Deepak and Satish Kalpo, 21 and 18, both of whom lived and worked on the island. Witnesses remembered Natalee dancing and laughing with the 3 of them as the night wore on. When the club started clearing out in the early morning hours, she told her friends she'd get back to the hotel on her own. She'd catch a ride with the guys she'd been talking to. Someone in her group watched her get into a light-colored car with the 3 young men and drive off. That's the last confirmed sighting anyone has of Natalee Holloway alive. The next morning was checkout day. When Natalee's friends went to find her so the group could head to the airport, they discovered her hotel room exactly as it had been left the night before. Bed made, suitcase packed and zipped, passport sitting right where she'd left it. Everything she owned for the trip was there. She wasn't. At first nobody panicked. 18-year-olds on a graduation trip lose track of time, fall asleep somewhere unexpected, forget to check in. But the calls to her phone went straight to voicemail, and the hunt around the hotel turned up nothing, and as the clock ticked toward their flight, confusion curdled into something closer to dread. Most of the students eventually had to board that plane. There was no alternative. But a small circle of Natalee's closest friends and a few of the adult chaperones stayed behind on the island. They called the local police. They called the U.S. consulate. And somebody made the call that no parent wants to receive. Your daughter didn't come back to the hotel, and we don't know where she is. Beth Holloway was on a plane to Aruba within hours of getting that news, alongside her husband and other family. She would spend years camped on that island, and she said something almost immediately that ended up defining the entire ordeal that followed. Aruba was the last place anyone knew her daughter to be, so Aruba was where she was going to stay until she had an answer. Aruban investigators, working the case the way any investigation starts, went straight to the last people known to have been with Natalee, van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers. Their initial story sounded almost plausible. They said they'd given Natalee a ride after the club closed, taken a short detour out to the California lighthouse on the island's northern tip, a popular spot for looking at the water, and then dropped her back at her hotel around 2 in the morning. In their version, she got out of the car, walked toward the entrance, and that was it. Whatever happened to her after that, they said, had nothing to do with them. It was a tidy story, and for a short window investigators treated the 3 young men as witnesses rather than suspects. Then the hotel's own records tore the story apart. The resort ran security cameras on its entrances, a front desk staffed around the clock, and an electronic keycard system that logged every single time a guest let themselves into a room. If Natalee had really been dropped off at 2 in the morning and walked inside, there would be a trail, a camera frame, a keycard swipe, a night clerk who remembered her. There was none of it. Investigators went through the footage and found no image of her crossing that lobby. Her keycard had not been used since she left for the club hours earlier. Nobody on the overnight staff recalled seeing a young American woman matching her description come through the doors. The men said she'd walked into that hotel. The hotel said, flatly, that she never did. Both versions couldn't be true, and the gap between them became the center of the entire case. Within a week, Aruban authorities arrested van der Sloot and both Kalpoe brothers. Other people connected to the 3 men, including van der Sloot's own father, were brought in for questioning as investigators tried to map out who knew what. By then the story had exploded far past the island. American cable news ran Natalee's senior portrait on a loop, night after night, and reporters flew in by the dozen to camp outside the courthouse and along the beach. Beth Holloway became a fixture on those broadcasts, composed, exhausted, and completely unwilling to let her daughter fade into a segment that eventually gets replaced by the next story. But Aruban law only allowed suspects to be held for a limited stretch without formal charges, and formal charges required actual evidence. Not a contradicted alibi, not a bad feeling, but proof. What investigators had instead was a story that had fallen apart and a missing girl with no physical trace anywhere on the island. Van der Sloot didn't make it any easier. Every time he was questioned, his account shifted, the timeline moved, the lighthouse detour got revised, small details were added or dropped or reversed entirely. It was the behavior of someone with something to hide, but inconsistency alone isn't a crime you can charge. After roughly 10 days, with nothing solid enough to hold them on, all 3 young men were released. And with that, the actual search for Natalee, the physical, exhausting, island-wide search, began in earnest. What followed was one of the largest search efforts the island had ever seen. Aruba is small, barely 20 miles end to end, but its terrain is brutal to search. Limestone riddled with fissures and hollow channels, sea caves, jagged coastline where the surf detonates against the rock. Aruban police worked alongside investigators from the Netherlands and the FBI, since Natalee was a U.S. citizen. They combed the beaches at dawn and dusk, when low light made every strange shape worth a second look. They crawled through caves that smelled of mineral and standing water. Volunteers flew in, including a Texas-based search specialist named Tim Miller, who had lost his own daughter years earlier and knew, in a way most people can't, exactly what Beth Holloway was living through. Divers went down along the reef lines. Sonar boats made slow, patient passes over the coastal shallows. Search teams checked a landfill, dune fields, and the scrubland near the lighthouse van der Sloot himself had pointed to. Nearly every lead, the tips, the anonymous calls, the psychics, went nowhere. The currents around the island are strong enough to carry something miles out and gone within days, and the ground itself seemed built to keep secrets. Month after month, the search produced an ever-growing list of places Natalee was not, and never once turned up where she was. Van der Sloot, meanwhile, never really left the spotlight. He kept surfacing in interviews and staged confrontations over the following years, offering yet another version of that night, each one contradicting the last, almost as if the attention itself was the point. In one especially strange turn, in November of 2007, a hidden recording captured him telling someone he'd trusted that Natalee had died that night and describing what he'd done with her body. For a moment, it looked like the case had finally cracked open. Then, confronted with the tape, he simply said he'd made it all up, that he'd been showing off, exaggerating to impress the person he was talking to. Without a body or any physical evidence to back it up, the recording was words on a tape and nothing more. It couldn't be turned into a charge. Once again, he walked. Years kept passing. The task forces wound down. The story that had once led every broadcast slipped into occasional retrospectives. In 2012, at the family's request, a probate court in Alabama formally declared Natalee Holloway dead. A legal formality more than anything, but a devastating one, putting the state's language to what her mother had spent 7 years refusing to say out loud. There was still no body. Still no conviction. Still no real answer. Just a declaration that the absence was permanent. For most cases, that's where the story would end, an unsolved file, a name people vaguely recognize from a bygone news cycle. But van der Sloot hadn't been reformed by any of it. And on May 30, 2010, 5 years to the day after Natalee vanished, he was in Lima, Peru, at a poker tournament, where he met a 21-year-old business student named Stephanie Flores Ramirez. She came from a well-known, well-regarded family in Lima and had her own plans, her own ambitions, and a family who loved her every bit as fiercely as Beth Holloway loved her daughter. Stephanie and van der Sloot left the tournament together and went back to his hotel room. She never came out of it. Hallway security cameras caught him leaving alone afterward, moving fast, visibly agitated. When hotel staff eventually went into the room, they found her dead. Van der Sloot fled the country almost immediately, crossing into Chile, where he was arrested on June 3, 2010, while apparently trying to make his way toward Argentina. This time, there was no ambiguity, because this time there was everything the Aruban case never had: a body, a crime scene, security footage, a documented trail. He was extradited back to Peru, and in January of 2012 he was convicted of murdering Stephanie Flores and sentenced to 28 years in prison, along with restitution owed to her family. Sit with that date for a second, because it's the coldest detail in the entire story. Exactly 5 years, to the calendar day, separated the disappearance of one young woman from the murder of another, at the hands of the same man. A man who, in 2005, had been arrested, questioned by investigators from 3 different countries, and let go for lack of proof. The 5 years of freedom in between weren't an abstraction. They had a direct, measurable cost, and that cost had a name. There's one more twist, and it's arguably the cruelest part of the whole story. Just days before he killed Stephanie Flores, van der Sloot had reached out to Beth Holloway's camp with an offer. For $250,000, he'd tell them exactly where Natalee's remains were. An arrangement was worked out with the FBI involved, and he was paid an initial $25,000. The location he gave was worthless, a lie sold to a grieving mother for cash, which he then took out of the country with him. That scheme sat quietly as an open federal case for years while van der Sloot served his sentence in Peru. It's what eventually forced the truth out into the open. In June of 2023, van der Sloot was temporarily extradited from Peru to the United States to answer for that extortion and wire fraud scheme. As part of the plea agreement his lawyers worked out with federal prosecutors, he agreed to sit for a recorded interview, a proffer, and lay out, in detail, exactly what happened to Natalee on the beach that night, with her parents present to hear it in real time. He also agreed to take a polygraph test to back up whatever he said. On October 18, 2023, in a federal courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, Natalee's home state, he pleaded guilty to the extortion and fraud charges and received a 20-year sentence, to run alongside the time he's already serving in Peru. The transcript of his confession, made public days later, laid out what happened. He said he and Natalee had been walking along the beach back toward her hotel, that they lay down together and started kissing, and that when he tried to go further she told him no and pushed him away, at one point kneeing him hard enough to make him stop. He said he stood up and kicked her in the face, hard, and that she went down, unconscious or worse. He said he spotted a cinder block lying nearby and struck her with it. And he said that once he saw what he'd done, he carried her into the water, walked out until it reached his knees, and pushed her body out into the sea before turning around and walking home. Beth Holloway later told reporters that hearing the part about her daughter fighting back, the detail about kneeing him, was the moment that told her it was real. "That's her," she said. "She fought like hell." Outside the courthouse that day, Beth Holloway told reporters plainly that after 18 years, her daughter's case had finally been solved, that Van der Sloot was no longer a suspect, he was the confirmed killer. The federal judge overseeing the case told him directly, in open court, that he had brutally murdered 2 young women, years apart, both of whom had refused his advances. It was, by any measure, an ending nobody had really believed would come. But it's worth being honest about what kind of ending this actually is, because it isn't the clean one people wanted. Natalee's remains have still never been found. The plea deal that produced the confession doesn't include a murder charge for her death, and the collapse of Aruba's original case years earlier means there was no domestic prosecution to build on. Van der Sloot has never stood trial for killing her. The truth came out only because he was cornered by an unrelated financial crime, and it came from a man with an 18-year track record of lying to investigators, lying on a hidden recording, and lying to a grieving mother for $250,000. That's the actual shape of the resolution, a confession without a conviction, delivered by the least trustworthy person imaginable, verified mostly by a polygraph and by the fact that its ugliest detail matched the daughter her mother actually knew. And that brings us to the part of this story that should be the hardest to sit with. Harder, honestly, than anything that happened on that beach. In 2005, this man was arrested. He was interrogated by investigators from Aruba, the Netherlands, and the United States. He was let go because the case against him didn't hold together well enough to charge. 5 years later, to the exact day, a 21-year-old woman in Lima was dead at his hands. That is not a coincidence you can wave away as fate. It's the direct, traceable cost of a system that couldn't hold him the first time. 2 mothers. 2 daughters. 2 entire futures that simply stopped, connected by one man who was free long enough to do it a second time. So it's worth remembering them the way they actually were, not the way he left them. Natalee Holloway, 18 years old, an honor student headed to college to become a doctor, on a trip meant to celebrate the beginning of her adult life. Stephanie Flores Ramirez, 21, a business student with her own family and her own future, 5 years and 1 continent away. And Beth Holloway, who spent nearly 2 decades refusing to let her daughter's name disappear into a cold case file, who kept talking to cameras long after most of them had stopped showing up, until the truth finally arrived, imperfect and incomplete as it was, because she never once agreed to stop asking for it.